What would you do if you gave 9 years of your life to build something magnificent, only to be publicly humiliated in front of everyone you'd ever led? Ethan Caldwell didn't scream. He didn't beg. He didn't threaten. He simply placed his badge on the table, looked the most powerful woman in the room straight in the eyes and walked away from everything he had built with his bare hands. They thought that was the end of his story. It was actually the beginning. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell, because what happens next will make you question everything you think you know about power, loyalty, and who truly holds the cards. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Like this video, so we can keep bringing you stories that hit different. Stay with me until the very end. You do not want to miss a single chapter of this one. The morning of March 14th arrived the way most Tuesdays do, in downtown Chicago, gray sky, pressing a speckle over the glass towers, cold that bites through a good coat and reminds you winter hasn't fully let go yet, even though the calendar says otherwise. Ethan Caldwell woke up at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before his alarm, which was something that happened more often than not. He lay still for a moment in the dark of his apartment, listening to the radiator knock and hiss in the corner. His daughter Lily was still asleep down the hall. He could tell by the silence. When she was awake, there was always some small noise, the creak of her bed, a cartoon she'd clicked on her tablet, the sound of her feet on the hallway floor. He got up carefully, the way parents learn to move in houses where small children sleep. The bathroom mirror wasn't kind that morning. He hadn't been sleeping well, and it showed the kind of tired that settles into a man's eyes and doesn't lift after one decent night. 32 years old, and sometimes he felt like he was carrying 45 inside his chest. He splashed cold water on his face, looked at himself without too much sentiment, and got moving. The drive to Northbridge took him 40 minutes on a good day. This wasn't a good day. There was a fender bender on the I-90 that backed everything up for six blocks, and Ethan sat in it with the radio off. Yes, sir, meaned, running through the quarterly numbers in his head the way some men run through song lyrics automatic, without having to think about it. The Northbridge division of Sterling Technologies had just closed its best quarter in recorded history. 31% revenue increase over the prior year. Client retention at 94%. 3 new enterprise contracts signed in February alone. He'd built that. Not entirely alone, he'd be the first to tell you he had a team of people who'd bled for this division, same as he had. But the architecture of it, the systems, the culture, client relationships that had been his work. 9 years of it. He'd started as a mid-level operations manager under the previous division head, a decent man named Roland, who'd retired 4 years in and left Ethan with a failing branch that was hemorrhaging clients and had just lost 2 senior engineers in the same month. He'd turned it around, slowly, painfully, with a lot of late nights and a lot of hard conversations and more than a few decisions that had made him deeply unpopular at the time. Pulled into the parking garage at 8:14 and took the elevator up to the 18th floor. Sandra, his assistant, was already at her desk when he walked in. She was 47, sharp, had a memory like a steel trap, and had been with the division longer than Ethan himself. She looked up when he came through the glass doors, and there was something on her face he didn't like. Kind of careful neutrality that Sandra didn't do naturally. "Good morning," she said. "What's wrong?" he said. She glanced toward the conference room at the far end of the floor. The blinds were drawn, which was unusual. "She's here," Sandra said quietly. "Vanessa. She's been here since 7:30, and she brought Tyler with her." Ethan paused. He set his bag down on the corner of Sandra's desk. Tyler Marsh was Vanessa Sterling's nephew. He was 24 years old, had an MBA from a school his aunt had donated a building to, and had spent the past year in some vague advisory role at Sterling Technologies' corporate headquarters that nobody had been entirely able to explain. Ethan had met him twice at company events. Both times, Tyler had spent most of the conversation looking at his phone. "Why?" Ethan asked. "No," Sandra said. But she asked that all division managers be in the main conference room at 9. He nodded, picked up his bag, and went to his office. He had 45 minutes, so he used them, checked his emails, reviewed his notes on the Hansen client account, which had a renewal meeting on Thursday, made a call to his daughter's school about a permission slip that needed to be signed. The class was going into the science museum, and Lily had been talking about it for 2 weeks. The woman at the front office was patient with him. He knew her by name. She knew him by name. That's what happens when you're the parent who shows up. By 8:45, Ethan could hear people moving toward the conference room. He straightened his jacket and followed. Vanessa Sterling was not a woman who entered rooms quietly. She was 30 years old, which struck people as remarkable, given what she controlled a technology company her father had founded and left primarily to her. When he died 6 years ago, valuation now estimated somewhere north of $4 billion. She was tall, precise, and dressed in a way that communicated she had thought about every detail and expected you to notice. She had her father's jaw and her mother's eyes, and a particular quality of attention that made you feel when she looked at you, like you were being weighed. She was standing at the head of the conference table when Ethan walked in, hands resting on the chair without gripping it. Tyler Marsh was to her right, slouched slightly in a way that suggested he either didn't know or didn't care what the posture communicated. He was wearing a very expensive suit that fit him imperfectly. The room filled up, 12 managers total, plus a few senior staff who'd been asked to attend. Ethan took his usual seat near the middle of the table, across from Marcus Webb, who headed client services and had been with Northbridge even longer than Sandra. Marcus caught Ethan's eye briefly but said nothing. Vanessa let the room settle and then spoke without preamble. "I'll keep this direct," she said. "I've been reviewing the structure of this division in the context of Sterling's broader organizational evolution. We've made some decisions at the leadership level that I want to communicate to you personally, rather than through a memo." Ethan watched her. Tyler stepping into an executive oversight role for Northbridge, effective immediately. He'll be working closely with me on a realignment of our operational priorities and reporting structure. Going forward, the division head will report directly to Tyler. The room was very quiet. Ethan kept his face still. He was aware of Marcus on his left, aware of Sandra standing near the door, aware of the particular quality of silence that fills a room when people understand something has just happened but aren't certain yet what it means. "Mr. Caldwell," Vanessa said, and looked directly at him. "You've done solid work building this division's numbers. That's recognized, but we feel that a fresh perspective at the oversight level is what this phase of growth requires. I'd like you to plan an onboarding session with Tyler this week to begin the transition of your key accounts and operational responsibilities. Solid work. 9 years of his life, and she called it solid work, the same way you'd compliment someone's garden." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Around the table, no one moved. He could feel them watching him, the way you watch someone standing at the edge of something. "Tyler," he said, without looking away from Vanessa, "how long have you been in a technology operations role?" Tyler shifted slightly. "I've been in strategic advisory for about a year and operations," Ethan said. "Not advisory, running systems, managing client accounts, dealing with actual infrastructure problems at 2 in the morning when a deployment goes bad." "How long?" Tyler's jaw tightened. "I've been developing relevant competencies across." "Ethan." Vanessa's voice was measured, but there was something underneath it. "A warning. I understand this isn't the news you were hoping for. This isn't a discussion." "No," he said. "I can see that." He looked around the table, at Marcus, who had lines around his eyes from years of doing this work. Sandra, whose hands were folded in front of her, too tightly. Deb Ramos, who ran project delivery, and had stayed at her desk until midnight more times than he could count to make a deadline happen. James Park, who'd turned down a better offer at a competitor company 2 years ago because he'd told Ethan he believed in what they were building. Tyler Marsh, who was 24 years old and was looking at his phone. Something settled in Ethan, not rage, not grief, exactly. Something quieter and more final. He reached into his jacket pocket and found his badge, the Sterling Technologies lanyard, the card with his photo and his name and the 9 years of access it represented. He set it on the table in front of him. The sound it made was very small. He stood up. "Vanessa," he said, "you built a company your father started. That's real. That takes something. I'm not dismissing that." He paused. "This division, the numbers you're benefiting from, the clients who've renewed because they trust us, the systems that run the way they run, that wasn't built by the Sterling name." Yes, he'd intervened. That was built by the people in this room, And you just told them that a 24-year-old who's never run anything is going to make decisions about their work. The silence in the room had a different texture now. So I won't be doing that onboarding, he said. And I won't be reporting to Tyler. Resign effective today. He said it evenly. No tremor, no performance. Just the facts. Vanessa's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. You're making an emotional decision. No, he said. I'm making a clear-eyed one. He picked up his bag from beside the chair. He looked around the table one more time, not a speech, just acknowledgement. One human being to the others. Marcus was looking at the table. James Park was looking at Ethan. Sandra had pressed her lips together, and her eyes were too bright. Take care of each other, Ethan said quietly, to no one and everyone. And he walked out. The elevator ride down was the longest 45 seconds of his life. He stood in it alone, watching the floor numbers descend, and the full weight of what he'd just done started to make itself known. In a dramatic way, there was no collapse, no moment where his knees gave. It was more like the way cold air hits you when you step outside after being in a warm building for a long time. A sudden clarity, a sudden awareness of exposure. He'd just resigned from the only professional identity he'd built since his mid-20s. He had a daughter, a mortgage, and a savings account that was decent but not indefinite. Job to go to. He had no plan that extended beyond the next hour. The lobby doors opened, and he walked out into the gray Chicago morning. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, people moving around him, a food cart 20 feet away, the smell of exhaust and coffee and cold concrete. He put his hands in his pockets and let the reality of it sit there with him. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Are you okay? He typed back, yeah. Tell everyone I said thank you. He started walking toward the parking garage. Was at school. She wouldn't be done until 3:15. Ethan drove back to his apartment with no music, no radio, nothing. Parked, he went upstairs, sat down at the kitchen table in his jacket, and stared at the refrigerator. On it, held by a magnet shaped like a sunflower, was a drawing Lily had made 2 weeks ago, a figure with brown hair and a purple tie, labeled in her careful 7-year-old printing, my dad. Run out of space for the last letter. He sat with it for a while. Then he got up, made coffee, note changed into something more comfortable, his laptop. He wasn't the kind of man who processed things by talking about them. He was the kind of man who processed things by doing something. It was a quality that had served him professionally and cost him personally. His ex-wife, Elena, had told him that more than once in the months before she left. How to just sit in something, Ethan. You always have to fix it. Maybe she was right. Maybe she wasn't. They'd been 24 when Lily was born, 26 when everything fell apart. The years since had been what they were functional, mostly civil. Better for Lily than the alternative. He opened a new document and started typing. Not a resume. A job application. Something else. He'd been thinking about it for a while. Longer than he'd admitted to himself. Even when things at Northbridge were going well, especially when they were going well, there had been a part of him that looked at struggling companies with good bones and bad leadership, and thought, what they're doing wrong. Exactly how to fix that. He'd just never had a reason compelling enough to act on it. He had one. By the time he left to pick up Lily, he had 6 pages of notes and the bones of something that felt, despite everything, like a beginning. Lily knew something was different the moment she got in the car. She was 7 years old, and she had her mother's instincts. She could read a room, read a face, before most adults had even noticed there was anything to read. She climbed into her booster seat and looked at him with those dark eyes and said, "Why are you wearing your weekend clothes?" "Because I came home early," he said. "Why?" He buckled her in, then got back in the driver's seat. He thought about how to say it. "I left my job today," he told her. Quiet for a second. "Did they fire you?" "No. I left on my own." Another pause. "Why?" He met her eyes in the rearview mirror. "'Cause something happened that wasn't right, and I decided I wasn't going to stay for it." She chewed on that for a moment, and the way she chewed on things, not accepting it immediately but not pushing back right away either. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked. Something about the way she asked it matter of fact, not scared, just checking almost got to him. "We're going to be okay. Promise?" "Promise." She accepted that, apparently, because she looked out the window and said, "Can we get tacos?" He laughed, actually laughed. The first real one of the day. We can get tacos. That night, after Lily was in bed, Ethan sat at the kitchen table again with his laptop and his notes, and a cup of coffee that went cold without him noticing. He'd received 11 text messages since that morning. Marcus, James Park, Deb Ramos, 3 other people from the division. Former colleague from his early career who'd somehow already heard. His mother who he hadn't told yet, which meant someone had. He read all of them. He didn't respond to most of them yet. The message from his mother said, "Sandra called me. You all right? Call me," he called her. She was 71, lived in Evanston, had been an elementary school teacher for 38 years before she retired. And she had never, in his entire life, treated him like he was fragile. She didn't start now. "Tell me what happened," she said. He told her all of it. She was quiet through most of it, the way good listeners are. When he finished, she said, "That woman made a mistake. She thinks she made a business decision," Ethan said. "That's the same thing," his mother said. "And she's going to find out eventually." A pause. "How's Lily?" She asked for tacos. "Good. She's a practical child. She gets that from you. She gets it from you," he said. He could hear her smiling. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to start something," he said. "I've been thinking about it for a while. I think this is the push I needed." "What kind of something?" "Consulting company. Turnaround work. Companies that are struggling with operations and leadership problems. I think I know how to do it." She didn't say anything for a moment. "You do know how to do it," she said finally. "You've been doing it for 9 years and giving the credit to someone else's company." He didn't have a good answer for that. "Get some sleep," she said. "Lily needs you steady. Everything else you can figure out." He didn't sleep well, but he didn't expect to. He lay in the dark and listened to the apartment make its small noises and thought about the look on Tyler Marsh's face when Ethan had asked him about operations experience. Embarrassment, he didn't think Tyler was capable of embarrassment. Exactly. More like irritation, the kind a person feels when something they've decided doesn't matter keeps getting mentioned. He thought about Vanessa. He tried to be fair to her, even in the privacy of his own head. She was 30 years old, and she was running a $4 billion company. That was real. She wasn't stupid. You didn't hold that together by being stupid. She had blind spots. Her blind spot was that she believed in the power of her own authority so completely that she couldn't see how much of what worked at Northbridge had nothing to do with her. She would find out. He wasn't glad about it. He didn't want the people he'd left behind to suffer for it. But he understood it was coming the way you understand a storm, from the way the light changes in the afternoon. Thought about James Park, who'd stayed when he could have left. About Deb Ramos, who probably had her resume updated by now, because Deb was smart. About Marcus, who had a wife and 2 kids in middle school and a mortgage bigger than Ethan's, and who could not afford to walk out the way Ethan had. He'd left them there. That was the part that sat with him heaviest. Yet, what he was going to be able to do about it. But he knew he wasn't going to forget them. In the morning, Lily made him toast. She couldn't operate the toaster herself. She wasn't allowed yet. The rule was 10, but she could take the toast out when it popped up and put it on a plate and carry it to him with a solemnity that suggested she understood this was an act of care. She set it in front of him and then climbed into her chair and looked at him. "Are you going to work today?" she asked. "Not to that office," he said. "But yes, I'm going to work." She seemed satisfied by that. She ate her cereal and told him about the science museum trip, which was apparently going to involve a planetarium show and possibly a volcano demonstration. And the gravity of this subject required her full attention for the remainder of breakfast. He watched her and thought about what he'd told her the night before. "Something happened that wasn't right, and I decided I wasn't going to stay for it." He hoped she'd remember that. He hoped someday when something happened to her that wasn't right, she'd remember that her father had stood up from a table and walked away from 9 years without flinching. He wasn't sure he'd managed it without flinching, but he hoped it had looked that way. For her, he drove her to school. He walked her to the door the way he always did, and she hugged him around the middle in that complete way small children hug, and then disappeared into the building without looking back, which he'd learned was a good sign. The kids who were struggling looked back. Lily didn't look back. He stood there on the sidewalk for a moment, hands in his pockets, the cold air finding all the usual gaps. Then he walked back to his car, opened his laptop on the passenger seat, and got to work. He registered the LLC that same week. Caldwell Consulting Group. He almost called it something more polished, something that sounded bigger than it was, and then he decided against it. He'd spent 9 years building something under someone else's name. This one would have his. He set up in the second bedroom of his apartment, the one that was technically a guest room but mostly stored boxes and Lily's art supplies. He cleared out enough space for a desk and a proper chair and an external monitor. He built a simple website in 2 evenings, nothing fancy but clear. What he did, how he did it, his background. He did not mention Sterling Technologies by name. He didn't need to. Anyone who knew the industry would know what Northbridge's turnaround over the past 9 years represented. The first inquiry came 14 days after his resignation. A mid-sized logistics company in Milwaukee with a serious operational problem and a leadership team that didn't know how to talk to each other. The owner had heard about him through a mutual contact. Ethan drove to Milwaukee on a Wednesday morning and spent 4 hours in a conference room, listening more than he talked. By the end of it, the owner had hired him. It wasn't a large contract. It was enough to make the math work for another 2 months and to confirm that what he'd been turning over in his head had legs. He drove back to Chicago with the radio on, the lake flat and gray to his right, and allowed himself something that wasn't quite optimism, but was adjacent to it. Something was starting. He didn't know yet what shape it would take, or how long it would take to get there. What was happening at Northbridge, though he had some ideas. He didn't know what Vanessa Sterling was thinking, or whether she'd thought about him at all since he walked out of that conference room. He knew he had a daughter who made him toast and asked practical questions and didn't look back when she walked through the school door. He had a desk in a room that used to hold boxes. He knew he had something to build. That was enough to start. The first sign that something was wrong at Northbridge came to Ethan secondhand, the way most things did now. It was a Thursday evening in late April, 6 weeks after he'd walked out, and he was sitting at his desk in the second bedroom when his phone rang. Marcus Webb. He picked up on the second ring. "You eating?" Marcus said. "I was about to." "Good. Eat first. This is going to ruin your appetite." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Tell me." Marcus exhaled. "Tyler held an all-hands this morning. He's restructuring the reporting system. Every project lead now has to submit daily status updates directly to him, not to their managers, directly to him. By 9 a.m., he wants them in a specific format, 4 pages minimum." Ethan was quiet for a second. 4 pages, every day. Per project. We have 11 active projects right now. The math on that was not complicated. 11 projects, 4 pages each, 9 a.m. deadline, every single day. Was 44 pages of documentation generated daily before anyone had done a single hour of actual work. Project leads, who should have been solving problems, would instead be writing reports about the problems they didn't have time to solve because they were writing reports. "What did people say?" Ethan asked. "What do you think people said?" "Nothing." "Anyway," a pause. "Deb said something to Sandra afterward. Can't repeat it in mixed company. What does Sandra think?" "Sandra thinks what Sandra always thinks, that she's going to keep her head down and do her job and outlast everyone who makes her life difficult." Another pause. "She asked about you. Tell her I'm fine. She knows you're fine. She wants to know if you're happy." Ethan thought about his Milwaukee client whose logistics operation was already showing improvement after 3 weeks of work. He thought about Lily, who had started asking whether he could come to her school's spring event, which he'd never been able to do before because of work. He thought about his apartment at 7 in the evening, the smell of whatever he was making for dinner, the absence of a commute. "I'm getting there," he said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "He moved your old office," he said. "Tyler. He moved into your office and put his name on the door." That one landed differently than Ethan expected. He hadn't thought about the office. Hadn't thought about the particular window that faced north, the one where you could see the lake on a clear day. The photo of Lily on the desk that he'd remembered to take with him. The whiteboard where he'd mapped out the Hansen account renewal strategy 4 months ago and never fully erased it. "Okay," he said. Marcus said, "It's his office now." "What else?" Marcus told him what else. And there was more than Ethan had anticipated, even accounting for his relatively low expectations of Tyler Marsh. The first 2 weeks after Ethan's departure, Tyler had apparently spent a significant amount of time in meetings, not working meetings with clients or project leads, what people were calling, behind closed doors, vision meetings. Long sessions where Tyler talked about where he saw Northbridge going and what his leadership philosophy was and how he intended to reshape the division's identity. Several of these meetings ran 2-3 hours. They produced no action items. They produced a 17-page document titled Northbridge Forward, a strategic realignment framework that used the word synergy 11 times. James Park had counted. In the third week, Tyler had begun making personnel decisions, promoted 2 people, both of them young, both of them with less than 2 years at the company, both of them. It happened. Yes, who laughed at Tyler's jokes in meetings. He'd moved Deb Ramos out of her role as project delivery head into something called process innovation coordination, which was a title that had no defined responsibilities and no direct reports. When Deb had asked what, specifically, she'd be coordinating, Tyler had told her the role was still being defined and that he valued her adaptability. She's looking, Marcus said. She's been on 3 interviews. I don't blame her, Ethan said. I don't either. After he hung up, he sat at his desk for a while, without opening his laptop. The apartment was quiet. Lily was asleep. Through the wall, he could hear the faint sound of the TV in the unit next door. He'd known something like this was coming. He hadn't known exactly what shape it would take. It was coming didn't make hearing about it any easier. Because of what it meant for him, he was out. He was building something else. His own trajectory was starting to look like it might actually go somewhere, but because of what it meant for the people still inside it. Marcus, who couldn't afford to walk. Sandra, who was trying to outlast someone who didn't understand what outlasting cost. James Park, who'd stayed because he believed in something and was now watching that thing get dismantled piece by someone who'd never had to build anything. He went to bed. He didn't sleep well. That was becoming a pattern. April became May, and May became a month of slow-motion damage. The 4-page daily reports lasted 11 days before even Tyler seemed to understand they were generating nothing useful. He replaced them with a different system weekly accountability summits, which were 2-hour Friday afternoon meetings where each project lead had to present their week's progress in front of the entire team. The format was Tyler's attempt to create what he called transparency culture. What it actually created was a 2-hour weekly exercise in people performing productivity for an audience rather than just doing the work. James Park called Ethan on a Friday evening in early May, just after one of these summits. He sounded the way people sound after a long flight, technically fine, but hollowed out. He asked me today, in front of everyone, why the Castellan account metrics were down from last quarter. James said. What did you tell him? Told him the Castellan account metrics were down because we lost 2 engineers off that project when you left, and we haven't backfilled them yet because HR has been waiting on Tyler to approve the job postings for 6 weeks. What did he say? Ethan asked. He said he'd look into it. James's voice had a flatness to it that Ethan recognized. It was the voice of someone who had stopped expecting answers to mean anything. Ethan, they haven't posted the jobs. It's been 6 weeks. Castellan is going to figure out they're being serviced by a skeleton crew and they're going to leave. Ethan thought about Castellan. He'd spent 8 months building that relationship. Their VP of operations was a woman named Ruth Nakamura, who had very high standards and a very long memory for being let down. Have you told Tyler that directly? Ethan asked. Not in a meeting. One-on-one. I tried. His assistant told me he doesn't do unscheduled drop-ins and I should submit a meeting request. Did you? 3 weeks ago. I'm still waiting. Ethan pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. Document everything, he said. Every warning you've given, every request, every response or non-response. Write it down with dates. Keep copies somewhere outside the company system. Think it's going to get worse. It wasn't a question, but Ethan answered it anyway. How much worse? He thought about how to be honest without being brutal. Depend on how long Vanessa lets it go before she gets involved. James was quiet. She hasn't been back. Not since that morning. Tyler talks to her on the phone, but nobody knows what he's telling her. That tracked. Vanessa had handed her nephew the wheel and driven away, and unless someone she trusted gave her a clear picture of what was happening, she'd only be getting Tyler's version. And Tyler's version, Ethan suspected, was doing very well. After he got off the phone with James, he opened his laptop and pulled up the Caldwell Consulting website. He had 3 clients, Now Milwaukee was going well, and he'd picked up 2 more referrals in the past month. One was a small manufacturing company in Rockford with a serious supply chain problem. The other was a family-owned retail group in the suburbs that was trying to figure out why their 2 best store managers had quit in the same month. He knew why without being told, but he let them explain it to him anyway, because people need to be heard before they can be helped. He worked until midnight. He wasn't good at stopping before he was done. And the problem was there was always more to do. Lily's science museum trip was on Thursday, and he'd promised he'd volunteer to chaperone, which meant he needed to be functional by 7 a.m., and not a man running on 3 hours of sleep and cold coffee. He closed the laptop at 12:07 and went to bed. June brought the first client departure. Ethan heard about it from Sandra, who texted him. On a Tuesday morning, Meridian Group sent a termination notice. Tyler told Vanessa it was due to market conditions. He stared at the text for a long time. Meridian Group was a mid-size financial services firm that had been a Northbridge client for 6 years. Ethan had personally managed that relationship for 3 of those years before handing it to Marcus's team. They paid well, renewed reliably, and served as a reference account that had helped close 2 other deals. Losing them wasn't just a revenue hit, it was a signal. He typed back, "What was the actual reason?" Sandra's reply took a few minutes. He imagined her typing somewhere Tyler couldn't see. "Ruth from Castellan called Marcus yesterday. She's asking questions. Marcus thinks they're next. Ruth Nakamura." He'd known it was coming. He put his phone down and went back to his work, because there was nothing he could do about Northbridge from where he sat. And sitting in grief over someone else's decisions was a way of letting those decisions take up space in his life that they hadn't earned. But he thought about Marcus. He thought about what Marcus would do when Castellan left. Because if Castellan left, there would be pressure to cut costs. First place Tyler would look to cut costs was people, and Marcus was not cheap. Marcus was worth every dollar he cost, but Tyler Marsh didn't know the difference between worth and cost. He texted Marcus, "How are you doing?" Actual answer. Marcus replied 4 hours later, "Honestly, tired. The kind of tired that doesn't go away on weekends." That kind. Ethan did know that kind. He'd lived inside it for the last 18 months at Northbridge, when the pressure had been building and the cracks were starting to show, and he'd been the person responsible for filling them all. He'd forgotten what it felt like not to carry it until he'd put down his badge and walked out and spent the next few days in a way that scared him before he's understood it was just the absence of weight he'd stopped noticing. He typed back, "I know it. Keep your resume current." "Already is," Marcus replied. The summer did not improve things. Deb Ramos left in July. She accepted a director-level position at a competitor and gave 2 weeks' notice on a Monday morning. Tyler's response, as reported by Sandra via text to Ethan that same afternoon, was to call a meeting to discuss backfill strategy and then spend 40 minutes of it talking about whether the role should be restructured before it was rehired. Deb had stopped by Sandra's desk on her way out on her last day. She didn't cry, Sandra told Ethan when she called him that evening. "Deb, she's not a crier. But she hugged me and she said, tell Ethan he was right to leave." And then she walked out. Ethan was standing in his kitchen, stirring something on the stove. Lily was at Elena's for the week they split time over the summer, which meant his apartment was very quiet in a way that sometimes felt like peace and sometimes felt like something else. "How are you doing, Sandra?" he asked. "Not the division." "You." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm fine," she said, in the way people say they're fine when they've decided not to burden you with the truth. A long pause. "It's hard," she said finally. "I've been in this building for 14 years. I know where everything is, every client by name. I know which copy machine jams on Wednesdays. I walk in every morning, and I don't recognize it anymore. The same furniture and the same carpet, and it doesn't feel like the same place." "Because it isn't," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He turned the burner down. "You can leave, Sandra?" "That. You're not obligated to outlast this." Another pause. "But someone has to keep the lights on. Someone has to know where the files are. If I leave, too, there'll be nobody left who remembers how anything was supposed to work." He understood that. He also understood that wasn't sustainable, that Sandra would eventually hit a wall, where the weight of holding things together by herself would exceed whatever loyalty or stubbornness was keeping her there. He hoped she'd know when she reached it. Call me when you need to talk, he said. Her voice softened slightly. How's Lily? She's good. She's at her mom's this week. She called me yesterday to tell me a fact about Saturn she'd learned. Sandra laughed, a small, real one. What was the fact? Something about the rings. I wrote it down. I didn't want to forget it. August arrived. With it, the project failure that would become months later, in retrospective accounts, the moment that marked the true beginning of the end for Tyler Marsh's tenure at Northbridge. Yes, he'd intervened. It was called the Vertex deployment, a large-scale infrastructure migration for a healthcare technology client that Northbridge had signed in January, before Ethan left, under a contract he'd personally negotiated. Timeline was aggressive but achievable. The kind of timeline Ethan had built a buffer into because he knew deployments never went exactly as planned. Team he'd assembled for it was good, experienced, cross-functional, with James Park as project lead. Tyler had looked at the Vertex contract in April and decided the timeline was too conservative. He'd moved the delivery date up by 6 weeks, citing competitive positioning and a desire to demonstrate Northbridge's accelerated capability. He'd done this without consulting James. He'd done it without consulting the client's technical team. He had announced it in one of his vision meetings and presented it as evidence of his leadership ambition. James had requested a meeting, had been given 20 minutes 3 weeks after the request. Explained in very clear terms what moving the timeline up by 6 weeks would do to a project of this complexity. Had brought documentation, had brought the specific list of risks. Tyler had told him he appreciated the feedback and that he had confidence in the team's ability to rise to the challenge. In the 3rd week of August, the Vertex deployment failed. Partially, not in a way that could be quietly patched and moved past. It failed in the way that projects fail when the people in charge have ignored every warning they were given completely, publicly, with the client's operations disrupted for 11 days and their executive team on the phone demanding explanations. James called Ethan at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. Ethan could hear it in his voice before he said a single word, the particular sound of someone who has been proved right about something terrible and feels no satisfaction in it whatsoever. It went down, James said. How bad? 11 days of disruption. They're estimating the cost to their operations at about $4 million. They're talking to their legal team. Ethan sat down in his desk chair. Where's Tyler? He was on the phone with Vanessa most of the afternoon. After that, James stopped. After that, he called a meeting of the full team, and he told us that the failure was the result of insufficient documentation from the project leads and a lack of proactive risk communication. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. He blamed the team, Ethan said. He specifically named 2 engineers by name in front of everyone. Said their performance gaps had created the situation. James. Ethan's voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it. Those engineers, are they the same 2 engineers who submitted written risk reports in June? His reports went to Tyler. Yes. Do you have copies? Pause. I took your advice, James said, after our call in May. I have copies of everything. Dated, time-stamped, saved outside the company system. Ethan exhaled slowly. Good. Don't show them to anyone yet. Keep them somewhere safe, Ethan. James's voice had something in it now. Anger. No, quite. Something harder. 2 good people got their names dragged through a company-wide meeting for something that happened because Tyler ignored their warnings. I want to do something about that. I know, Ethan said. I understand, but the timing matters. Right now, Tyler is still the person with the power. You need to wait until the power shifts. And if it doesn't shift, we'll shift, Ethan said. He didn't say it like a prediction. He said it like someone stating the outcome of a calculation they'd already run. Things that are built the way Tyler is building them don't hold. They fall. The only question is when. James was quiet for a moment. How do you do it? Not being angry. I am angry, Ethan said simply. I'm just not letting the anger make decisions for me. By September, Ethan's consulting company had 7 active clients. He wasn't sleeping well, that hadn't really changed, but he was sleeping badly in a different way now. Before, the sleeplessness had been anxiety. The grinding middle-of-the-night kind that replays problems without solving them. It was more like a mind that wouldn't stop working, because there was genuinely a lot to work on. Subtly different. Not comfortable, exactly, but more like the feeling you get from being tired after something real, rather than tired from carrying something invisible. He'd hired his first employee. Her name was Carol Estes, 53 years old, former operations director at a company that had been acquired and dissolved, brilliant with systems and processes, and utterly incapable of tolerating incompetence without her face showing it. He'd interviewed 4 people and hired Carol in the first 10 minutes, which he recognized was not best practice, but was also obviously correct. You're going to be honest with clients, even when they don't want to hear it? He'd asked her in the interview. She'd looked at him with an expression that said she found the question slightly insulting. If I wasn't going to be honest, I'd have stayed in corporate. He'd offered her the job before she'd finished her coffee. With Carol handling the operational side of 3 of his smaller clients, Ethan had been able to take on a larger engagement, a regional manufacturing company in Indiana, with a serious leadership dysfunction problem that was costing them something in the neighborhood of $2 million a year in turnover and inefficiency. It was exactly the kind of problem Ethan was made for. He drove to Indiana twice a week and spent hours inside the company, talking to people at every level, building a picture of the actual situation versus the official story. 2 pictures were very different, as they usually were. Anstey on one Wednesday evening in late September, driving back from Indiana on the I-65 with the sun going down over flat farmland and the radio playing something he wasn't really listening to. He let himself acknowledge something he'd been reluctant to say out loud, even in his own head. He was good at this. He'd always been good at it. Yes, but he'd been doing it for someone else, inside a structure someone else controlled, constrained by decisions that didn't always make sense, but that he had to accept because they came from above. The structure was his. The decisions were his. Clients were his. The results were his. His name was on the door. Thought about the conversation he'd had with his mother the night he resigned, when he'd told her he'd wanted to build something. She'd said he'd been doing it for 9 years and giving the credit to someone else's company. He understood that better now. You don't really know what you're capable of building until the building is yours. He was in the middle of a client call on a Friday morning in October when Sandra texted him. He saw it afterward when he got off the phone. Castellan is gone. Ruth sent a termination letter this morning. Tyler told people it was a mutual decision. It wasn't. He set the phone down on his desk. Castellan and Meridian, 2 of the 3 anchor accounts he'd built over the past 4 years. Gone in the same quarter. Together they represented somewhere in the range of 30% of Northbridge's annual revenue. He picked up the phone and called Marcus. Marcus answered on the first ring. You heard, Marcus said? Sandra texted me. Ruth Nakamura called me personally to say goodbye. She said, paused, she said, and I'm quoting, please tell Mr. Caldwell that we always valued our relationship with him and that this decision had nothing to do with his team. How's the team taking it? Quiet, the bad kind of quiet. People are scared, Ethan. They can see the math. If the next quarter looks anything like this one, there are going to be layoffs. He heard something in Marcus's voice that he recognized from their years of working together. Marcus was a steady man, not prone to catastrophizing, not someone who reached for the worst case first. When Marcus sounded scared, it was because the situation warranted it. You updating your resume? Ethan asked. A pause. I've had some conversations. Good, Ethan said. Keep having them. I have 2 kids, Ethan. I can't just walk out the way. Marcus stopped himself. Sorry, that's not fair. It's accurate, Ethan said. You had reasons to stay that I didn't have. There's nothing wrong with that, he thought for a moment. What does Vanessa know? Tyler controls what she knows. But the board has quarterly reports. The Q3 numbers are going to be impossible to spin. When does the board see Q3 November? Ethan did the math. 6 weeks. Northbridge could lose more clients in 6 weeks. Senior people would keep leaving. The institutional knowledge that had taken years to build, the kind of knowledge that lived in people's heads has not in documentation, was walking out the door every time someone like Bramos accepted an offer somewhere else. Marcus, he said, I need you to do something for me. Nothing dramatic, nothing that puts you at risk. But if you hear anything board conversations, financial projections, anything about what Vanessa is actually being told, I want to know. A long silence. Why? Ethan thought about how to answer that. Thought about the Milwaukee client, now running at substantially better efficiency than when he'd taken them on. Thought about Carol Estes and the Indiana Manufacturing Company and the website with his name on it. He thought about Lily asking if they were going to be okay, and himself saying yes. Because I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do about Northbridge, he said. But I want to have all the information when I decide. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then, okay, he said. After he hung up, Ethan sat at his desk and looked out the window for a while. The leaves were turning. The light was that particular October light, clean and a little melancholy, the kind that makes everything look like it matters more than usual. He thought about 9 years of his life that had been poured into a building he didn't own, into systems with someone else's name on them, into relationships that technically belonged to a company that had publicly humiliated him in front of his peers, sent him as expected to smile and stay. He thought about where those 9 years now lived, the heads of people who were being ignored and managed out, inside client relationships that were dissolving one termination letter at a time, inside an operation that was unraveling thread by thread because the person holding the needle had no idea what he was unraveling. He was not glad about it. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He didn't want this outcome. He didn't want Marcus scared. He didn't want Sandra keeping the lights on, alone. He didn't want 2 engineers to get their names attached to a failure that came from warnings they'd put in writing and had ignored. What he wanted was for people who built things to be treated as though what they built had value. It hadn't happened. No. And now he was sitting in his own office with his own name on the door, watching the consequences of that choice play out from a distance. And the question that had started as something quiet in the back of his mind was becoming harder to ignore. The question was simple. It was not comfortable. If someone could save what was left of Northbridge and that someone turned out to be Ethan Caldwell, what would that be worth to him and at what price? He didn't have an answer yet, but he was starting to understand that eventually, one way or another, someone was going to ask him the question out loud. He turned back to his laptop. He had a client report to finish. He had Carol's check to sign. He had to call Lily's school about a conference next week that he was, for the first time in years, actually going to be able to attend. He got back to work. The Q3 report landed on the board's table on a Thursday morning in November, and by all accounts, it was not a quiet meeting. Ethan wasn't there. He heard about it the way he'd been hearing about most things at Northbridge for the past 8 months secondhand, through people who were, and the picture they painted came in pieces over the following 48 hours, like a photograph developing slowly in a darkroom. Marcus called first at a little past 7 in the evening. Ethan was helping Lily with a math worksheet at the kitchen table, the kind with fractions that required more patience than the actual math. He held up one finger to her and stepped into the hallway. Board meeting ran 4 hours, Marcus said. 4 hours, Ethan. These are people who usually want to be done in 90 minutes. What happened? The Q3 numbers were bad enough on their own. Revenue down 22% from the same quarter last year. 2 anchor clients gone. 3 senior people resigned in the quarter. But someone on the board had done their homework. A pause. They had copies of the risk reports, the ones from the Vertex project, the ones Tyler ignored. Ethan leaned against the hallway wall. How did they get those? I don't know. James might know. But they had them, and they had the dates, and they had Tyler's email responses, which were essentially nothing. And then they had the Vertex post-mortem report that Tyler submitted, which blamed the project leads. So they had both documents in the same room, side by side. The picture that created wasn't complicated. Engineers submit written warnings about project risks. Executive receives warnings, does nothing. Project fails catastrophically. Executive submits report blaming engineers. Board sees all of this simultaneously. How did Vanessa handle it? Ethan asked. Marcus took a moment to answer, which was answer enough. She defended him. At first, she said the risk communication had been inadequate, that Tyler had made decisions based on the information available to him. Someone on the board asked her if she'd read the risk reports herself. Another pause. She hadn't. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. She didn't know about them, Marcus said. I think that was genuinely true. I don't think Tyler was sharing the actual operational picture with her. He was giving her the version where everything was ambitious and forward-looking, and the numbers were a temporary adjustment. She believed it because she wanted to, or because she didn't ask the right questions. Both. Marcus exhaled. The board isn't suspending her yet. But they put 3 things on the table. An independent operational audit. Formal review of Tyler's role. And a timeline. They want a recovery plan submitted within 60 days, or they're going to start making changes themselves. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Down the hall, he could hear Lily at the kitchen table, the scratch of her pencil, the small sound she made when she got an answer wrong and had to erase it. 60 days isn't much time, Ethan said. No, and the people who could actually build a recovery plan. Marcus didn't finish that sentence. He didn't need to. Keep me informed, Ethan said. Pause. Ethan, people are scared, not just nervous. Actually scared. About their jobs, about the clients, about what happens if the audit turns up things nobody expected. Does anyone think it will? A long silence. Sandra found some things, Marcus said carefully. In the financial reporting, discrepancies between what was submitted to the board in the quarterly summaries and what the actual project accounts show. She's not an accountant. She doesn't know exactly what she's looking at. But she knows something doesn't match. It was new information, and it shifted the shape of the situation in a way Ethan hadn't anticipated. Sandra needs to be careful, he said. She needs to document what she found and not say anything to anyone inside that building until she knows who she can trust. I told her the same thing. Good, he thought for a moment. Tell her to call me. Sandra called the next morning, a Friday, at 7:43 a.m., while Ethan was dropping Lily at school. He took the call in the parking lot with the engine running. She was careful on the phone in the way people are when they're aware of where they are and who might walk past. She spoke in a kind of compressed, efficient shorthand enough for Ethan to understand, not enough to be damaging if somehow overheard. What she'd found wasn't evidence of anything criminal, not that she could identify. It was more like the fingerprints of bad decisions being covered over. Project costs logged to the wrong accounts. Client retention bonuses payments made to certain clients to delay their departure buried in line items that described them as software licensing fees. Q2 summary submitted to the board had shown a client retention rate of 81%. The actual project-level data showed something closer to 67. He was managing the picture, Ethan said. That's what it looks like, Sandra said. I don't know if Vanessa knew. I don't think she knew. But someone knew, because these entries didn't make themselves. Sandra, he kept his voice level. I want you to make copies of everything you found. Personal copies outside the system. And then I want you to stop looking. Go deeper. You've found enough. Going deeper makes you a target. Pause. Okay, she said. Are you all right? I've been better. Her voice was dry in the way it got when she was holding something together by force of will. Keep thinking about when you put your badge on the table. I thought you were making a mistake. And now? Now I think you were the only one who read the room correctly. She paused. I should have left with you. You stayed. Because you're the kind of person who stays, he said. That's not a flaw. That's just who you are. It's exhausting, she said quietly. Call me whenever you need to. That's not a polite thing I'm saying, I mean it. After he hung up, he sat in the parking lot for a while with the engine idling. The school was quiet now, all the kids inside. A few other parents were leaving, backing out of spaces, a woman in a minivan waving to someone Ethan didn't recognize. He pulled out of the lot and drove back to his apartment and went straight to his desk. He opened a new document. Not a client report, not a consulting proposal, something different. He started building a picture, everything he knew about Northbridge's current state, assembled from the various sources that had been feeding him information over the past 8 months. Revenue trajectory, client departures and their approximate dollar values, personnel purse losses, and the institutional knowledge that walked out with each one. The Vertex failure and its likely legal exposure, the financial discrepancies Sandra had found, the board's 60-day timeline. It took him most of the morning. When he was done, he had 6 pages of dense, organized analysis that painted an extremely picture of a company that was not in a downturn, but in a structural collapse, one that was still happening in real time and would continue to happen unless someone intervened, with both the capability and the authority to stop it. He read it through twice. Then he opened a second document and started writing something else entirely. November moved the way it does in Chicago, fast gray, the light going early in the afternoons and the cold settling in with a seriousness that reminded you it wasn't planning to leave for a long time. Ethan drove to Indiana twice a week, took calls from Carol on the other days, reviewed a proposal for a new client in Cincinnati that would be his largest engagement yet if it came through. The Cincinnati meeting was on a Tuesday. He drove down with his laptop and a thermos of coffee and sat across a conference table from a family of three two adult sons who had built a regional distribution company over 30 years and were watched lose money in ways they didn't fully understand. They were proud people, the kind who found it hard to say they needed help. The father, a man in his mid-60s named Raymond Cho, had spent most of the first hour explaining why most of what had gone wrong wasn't his fault, which was a thing Ethan had learned to let happen without pushing back. Because the truth usually came out on its own once people felt heard. Came out when the younger son, who'd been quiet for most of the meeting, finally said, "Dad, we need to tell him about the warehouse." Raymond Cho had looked at his son for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, not collapse, but a kind of releasing, the look of a man who's been holding a particular door shut for a long time and has just decided to let it open. "Tell me about the warehouse," Ethan said. He drove home from Cincinnati with the contract signed. He called Carol from the road. "We got Cincinnati," he said. "Finally," she said. "I've been managing your calendar for this one since September. Do I want to know what you had to move?" "Nothing you need to worry about. I handled it." A pause. "How bad is their situation?" "Fixable," he said. "Complicated but fixable. I'll brief you Thursday." Also, a woman named Irene Voss called today. She said she's a board member at a technology company called Sterling, and she'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. The name landed quietly, but with weight. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. The highway was straight and dark, and headlights came at him in the left lane at regular intervals. "Did she say what about?" he asked. "She said it was confidential. She left a number. I'll call her tomorrow," he said. He didn't call her that night. He had dinner with Lily, who was in a phase of being intensely interested in the solar system and had a lot of opinions about Jupiter's moons that she wanted to share. He did the dishes while she talked at him from the kitchen table. He asked questions because he was genuinely interested, and because she was genuinely interesting, which was something that still caught him off guard. Sometimes not that his daughter was interesting. Always known that he had the time now to actually notice it. Put her to bed at 9. She asked him to sit with her for a few minutes, which he did. On the edge of her bed, in the dark, her breathing slowed. Then he went to his desk and sat for a long time in the quiet. Irene Voss, he knew the name. She'd been on Sterling Technologies board for 4 years, a former CFO of a logistics company, sharp, numbers-oriented, someone who called people out of nowhere for no reason. Board had its 60-day timeline. They were somewhere in the middle of it. The audit was presumably underway, and a board member was calling Ethan Caldwell. He already understood what that call was going to be about. He'd understood it in some form since October, since the question had started forming in the back of his mind during the drive back from Indiana with the sun going down. Question about what saving Northbridge would be worth to him, and at what price. He was starting to have a clearer sense of the answer. Called Irene Voss, the next morning desk, Carol having been instructed to hold everything until 11. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice was what he expected, direct, not unfriendly, carrying the particular quality of someone who had spent decades in rooms full of people trying to obscure things and had long since stopped being patient with it. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "thank you for returning my call. I'll be direct. Please," he said, "I'm on the board of Sterling Technologies. I'm also leading the independent operational audit of the Northbridge division, which the full board commissioned 3 weeks ago. I've been reviewing the division's history, its performance trajectory, and the circumstances of the current situation. Spoken with a number of people, including some who still work there and some who've left." A brief pause. "Your name comes up consistently." "I imagine it does," Ethan said. "Picture I'm building is not a flattering one for the company's recent leadership decisions. I think you know that." Another pause. "I'd like to meet with you in person. Privately, not as a representative of the board pursuing any specific agenda. I want to be clear about that. But as someone trying to understand what actually happened at Northbridge and what, if anything, can be done about it." "What makes you think I'd want to help with that?" he asked. Hostile, just honest. A slight pause as if she appreciated the directness. "Know that you would. That's partly what I'd like to understand." She paused again. "Mr. Caldwell, I've been on corporate boards for 18 years. I've seen a lot of situations. What happened to you in that conference room in March was handled poorly. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Poorly, he said. Badly, she corrected, without missing a beat. It was handled badly, and the consequences of it are what some now significant time trying to untangle. I think you deserve to hear that from someone at the board level. He was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the November street below bare trees, a woman walking a dog, the particular gray light of late autumn. I'll meet with you, he said, but I want to be clear about something first. Ahead, I'm not a Sterling employee. I have my own company, my own clients, my own obligations. I'm not coming to any meeting as someone looking to go back to what I had. Whatever I bring to that conversation, I'm bringing it as an independent party with my own interests. That's not what you're looking for. We should know that now. Pause. That's exactly what I'm looking for, Irene Voss said. Can you do next Wednesday? They met at a restaurant in the Loop, not the kind of place where tech executives took clients, not loud or trendy, just a quiet Italian place with good lighting and enough ambient noise that a conversation couldn't easily be overheard. Irene Voss was in her late 50s, compact, gray hair cut efficiently, a watch that was good but not ostentatious. She was already there when Ethan arrived, which he respected. She had ordered water. He ordered coffee. They ordered food because not ordering food in an Italian restaurant felt rude, and then mostly ignored it. She had done her research. That was clear within the first 10 minutes. She knew the Northbridge revenue numbers going back 7 years. She knew the client list, the retention rates, the headcount trajectory. She knew about the Vertex project, the risk reports, the engineers Tyler had named in his post-mortem. The financial irregularities are the most serious problem, she said. The independent auditors found them within the first week. It's not evidence of large-scale fraud, more like someone managing the numbers to protect a narrative. But it misled the board, and that's not something we can overlook. How does Vanessa fit into that? Ethan asked. Our current assessment is that she wasn't aware. Tyler was filtering information to her. She made decisions based on what she was told, and what she was told was incomplete. Irene paused. That doesn't absolve her of the oversight failures. She should have had better systems for getting accurate information. She trusted her nephew in a way that wasn't professionally appropriate. Another pause. But she didn't authorize misrepresentation to the board. Appears to have been Tyler acting independently. Ethan thought about that, about the Vanessa Sterling who had sat at the head of that conference table in March confident, certain, completely sure she was making the right call. Never thought she was corrupt. He'd thought she was wrong, was a difference. Even if the consequences looked similar from the inside. What does the board want? He asked. Irene set down her water glass. The board wants Northbridge stabilized. The division is not worthless. The underlying infrastructure, some of the remaining client relationships, the market position it once had, these have value. But that value is evaporating. We have, at our current trajectory, 12 to 16 weeks before it becomes very difficult to argue for saving the division at all, versus simply shutting it down or selling the assets. 12 to 16 weeks. He'd done similar math himself, sitting at his kitchen desk in October. Tyler? He asked. Tyler's role is under formal review. The board has the authority to remove him, and I expect that authority to be exercised within the next few weeks, depending on what the audit concludes. She paused. Vanessa's role is also under review. The board has asked her to step back from operational decisions while the audit completes. That's not the same as removing her. No, it's not. Irene looked at him directly. The board is not trying to destroy the Sterling company. We're trying to determine whether it can be salvaged and under what structure. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Around them, the restaurant moved a waiter refilling glasses, a table of 4 near the window, laughing at something. The ordinary human noise of a Wednesday lunch. What are you asking me, specifically? He said. I'm asking whether you'd be willing to consult for the board formally, at a rate that reflects your current market value on a recovery assessment for Northbridge. A commitment to anything further than that. Just your honest, professional analysis of whether the division is salvageable, what it would take, and what the realistic timeline looks like. He'd expected something like this. He'd told himself he was prepared for it. Sitting across from Irene Voss, with the question actually on the table, the actual weight of it settled differently than he'd expected. There are people in that building, he said, who gave years to that division, who were ignored and sidelined and blamed for other people's failures. Whatever I do with any of this, their situation matters to me. That's not negotiable. Irene didn't look surprised. I understand that. And I need to be clear, I'm not doing this for Vanessa Sterling. I'm not interested in saving her reputation or making her look better to the board. If the recovery of Northbridge happens to serve her interests, that's incidental. Understood, Irene said. I'll do the assessment, he said. But I'm going to do it my way, on my timeline, talking to whoever I need to talk to. And I'm going to tell you the truth about what I find, even if it's not what you want to hear. Mr. Caldwell, Irene said, yes, he'd something. And there was something in her voice that might have been the closest she got to warmth. That's precisely why I called you. He told Carol about it that afternoon. She listened without interrupting, which was not something Carol did naturally, which told him she understood the weight of it. When he finished, she said, "Are you going to be able to be objective about this?" He said, "I'm going to be honest about it, which is better." She thought about that. Same thing? Not always. Objective means trying to remove yourself from the picture. I was inside that division for 9 years. I can't remove myself from the picture, and I'm not going to pretend I can. But I can be honest about what I know and what I saw and what the numbers say. And if the honest answer is that it can't be saved, that's what I'll tell them. Carol gave him the look she gave him when she thought he was being more rational than the situation deserved. And the people's inside, Marcus and Sandra and whoever else is still hanging on, that's why it matters whether it can be saved, he said quietly. That's the whole point. He spent 2 weeks on the assessment. He interviewed 11 people, current employees, former employees, thy outside auditors, 2 clients who'd left, and 1 who was still there, but actively considering leaving. He reviewed every financial document the board made available to him, and several that he asked for specifically because they weren't in the initial package. He drove to the Northbridge building on a Thursday morning and sat in the lobby for 20 minutes, waiting for a conference room to be cleared, which it turned out hadn't actually been reserved properly, which was a small thing but said something. The building felt different than it had in March. Not quieter exactly, the noise level was similar. But something in the energy was wrong, the way a house feels wrong when you walk in and you don't know yet what's different. But something is. He talked to James Park for 2 hours in a conference room on the 14th floor with the door closed. James looked tired in a way that had become structural, settled into him like a change in posture. He was still there. That surprised Ethan a little. "Why did you stay?" Ethan asked him, not as part of the assessment, just personally. James thought about it. "Because I kept thinking someone was going to fix it," he said. "And then I kept thinking, maybe I was the someone who was supposed to fix it. Then I ran out of things to think, and as I was just still here." Ethan nodded. He understood that. "Is it fixable?" James asked him. "Actually, not what the board wants to hear. What do you actually think?" "I think it's barely fixable," Ethan said. "I think there's a window, and it's not big, and if nothing meaningful changes in the next 2 months, it closes." James looked at him. "And if the window doesn't close?" "Someone would need to come in with the actual authority to make real decisions, not a consulting engagement, not an advisory role. Real authority. And they'd need the right people around them." James was quiet for a moment. "Would you do it?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked at the conference room table, not his old table. The one in the big room on 18, a similar table. The same neutral gray laminate, the same kind of chairs. He'd intervened. He thought about the assessment document he was building and what it was starting to say and what the implications of that were. "No yet," he said, and that was true. He submitted the assessment to Irene Voss on a Monday evening in late November. 12 pages. Hedging. Softening. The conclusion was direct. Bridge was salvageable, but only barely, only under specific conditions. The financial losses could be contained. Several client relationships could be repaired if the right person made the call quickly. The institutional hadn't entirely left. There were still people inside who remembered how things were supposed to work and would respond to real leadership. The leadership would have to be real, not advisory, not transitional. Real authority, real accountability, real decision-making power. Irene called him 40 minutes after he sent it. "You're describing a specific kind of intervention," she said. And the person you're describing, the qualifications, the approach, the specific knowledge of Northbridge's systems and relationships. Yes, he said again, a pause. I'm going to be direct with you. I'd be surprised if you weren't. The board is prepared to move on Tyler this week. Vanessa is going to be asked to step back from division oversight formally. And we need to talk about what comes next. Another pause. Are you ready to have that conversation? He was at his desk. Through the wall, he could hear Lily's TV. She was allowed 45 minutes before bed, and she used every minute of it. Radiator knocked in the corner. The November wind pressed against the window. He thought about March, about the conference room on 18, and the badge on the table and the elevator ride down that had been the longest 45 seconds of his life. About the lobby and the cold air, and standing on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and the full weight of what he'd done settling on him. About driving home with no music and sitting at the kitchen table in his jacket, staring at Lily's drawing on the refrigerator. Thought about everything that had been built, about what it had taken, about how much of it was still in there, underneath the damage, waiting for someone who knew what it was supposed to look like to come and find it. I'm ready, he said. He said it steadily, without performance, because it was simply true. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Irene Voss said, "Good. I'll be in touch by Wednesday." After he hung up, he sat for a moment in the quiet of his apartment. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel like anything had been won. He felt the weight of a decision that wasn't final yet, but was moving toward finality, the way a river moves, not dramatically, not all at once, but with a certainty that doesn't require speed. He got up, went to check on Lily, found her asleep with the TV still on, one arm thrown over the edge of the bed. He turned off the TV and pulled her blanket up and stood in the doorway for a moment, in the dark. Then he went back to his desk. He had a Cincinnati report to finish and a morning call with Carol and a question forming in his mind about what kind of terms he was actually willing to accept. Not what the board was offering, but what he was willing to accept, which was a different thing and needed to be thought through carefully before Wednesday. He opened his laptop and got to work. The Wednesday call with Irene Voss lasted 40 minutes and covered the kind of ground Ethan had spent 3 days preparing for: compensation structure, scope of authority, timeline expectations, reporting relationships. Irene was precise and fair and didn't waste words. By the end of it, they had the bones of a proposal that Irene said she'd take to the full board for a vote the following week. What they didn't have was Vanessa. That wasn't a surprise. Ethan understood that Vanessa Sterling was not going to be removed from the picture. Entirely, she was still the majority shareholder, still the founder's daughter, still the person whose name was on the company, even if the board had temporarily pulled her back from operational decisions. Whatever happened next at Northbridge was going to happen in her shadow, whether anyone wanted it to or not. He didn't hear from Vanessa directly. Not that week, not the week after. He heard from Irene that the board vote had gone through. Tyler's formal removal from his oversight role was approved unanimously, which Irene relayed with a kind of flat neutrality that suggested she'd expected nothing less. The independent audit's final report was submitted, its findings logged, its recommendations noted. The division's interim management was a 3-person committee of existing senior staff. Everyone on the board privately understood was a placeholder while the real question got sorted out. The real question being Ethan. He was sitting in a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning in the first week of December, reviewing his notes for the Cincinnati call at noon, when his phone showed a number he didn't recognize. Chicago area code. He almost let it go to voicemail. He answered. Instead, the way you sometimes do when something tells you to. The voice was Vanessa Sterling's. He was quiet for exactly 1 second. "Vanessa, I'd like to meet with you." No preamble. Small talk. That was consistent with how he remembered her. "Today, if possible, or tomorrow, whatever works for you." He looked at his notebook, his coffee, the window onto the December street outside. "Tomorrow works," he said. 11 o'clock. There's a coffee shop on Wabash called Mercer's. Do you know it? A brief pause, as if she'd expected to be offering the location. "I can find it," she said. "I'll see you then," he said, and ended the call. He sat for a moment after. Around him, the coffee shop moved a barista, calling out a name, someone's laptop playing something quiet. 2 women at the next table, talking about something that had nothing to do with any of this. He drank his coffee and then opened his notebook and went back to his Cincinnati prep because the noon call was happening regardless of what Vanessa Sterling wanted, and his clients didn't stop needing his attention because a billionaire had decided to pick up the phone. He called Carol after the Cincinnati call. "Vanessa Sterling called me this morning," he said. Carol didn't say anything for a moment. "Are you going to meet with her?" "Tomorrow morning. Do you want me there?"
He thought about it.
"This one I do alone." "Okay," a pause. "How are you feeling about it?" "No yet," he said, which was honest. "Ask me tomorrow afternoon." He got to Mercer's at 10:50. He ordered a coffee and took a table near the back, not a power move, just his preference. He didn't like sitting near the door. Place was the kind of Chicago coffee shop that had been there for 20 years and showed it, with mismatched chairs and a floor that slanted slightly toward the east wall and the best house blend in a 4-block radius. Vanessa arrived at 11:02. She was wearing a coat he didn't recognize, dark charcoal, expensive but not showy, the kind of thing a person buys when they're dressing to be taken seriously rather than to be seen. Her hair was different than he remembered. Or maybe it was the winter light. She looked, he thought, tired. Not visibly distressed, not diminished. She wasn't that kind of person. He didn't think she ever would be, but carrying something. The specific weight of someone who has spent months watching consequences arrive that they cannot argue their way out of. She sat down across from him. A server came. She ordered tea. The server left. They looked at each other across the table for a moment, with the particular awkwardness of people who have a shared history that neither of them is sure how to reference. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. "Of course," he said. She wrapped both hands around the mug the server had ordered. It was water, apparently, while the tea steeped, and seemed to make a decision about something. "I'm not going to do this the wrong way," she said. "I'm not going to pretend the last 9 months haven't happened, or that the situation you walked away from in March was handled well. It wasn't." He watched her. He didn't say anything. "I made a decision about Tyler that was driven by things that had nothing to do with operational logic. He's family. My father liked him. I thought giving him a significant role would help him grow into it." She paused. "I was wrong about what he was capable of. I was wrong about how he'd handle the authority. And I should have been paying closer attention to what was actually happening, instead of relying on what he told me." Ethan kept his voice even. "What do you want, Vanessa?" She met his eyes. "I want you to come back to Northbridge." This was what she was going to say. He'd known it since Irene's first call, maybe before. But hearing it out loud from Vanessa herself in a coffee shop on a Tuesday in December had a different texture than knowing it abstractly. "The board has already spoken with me," he said. "I know. Irene told me about the proposal." A pause. "This isn't the board asking. This is me, separately." She paused again, as if measuring something. "I'm offering double your old salary, and a significant bonus performance-based, tied to the division's recovery metrics, structured over 18 months. The specifics are—" "I heard you," he said, "and I appreciate the offer." She waited. "I'm not going to take it," he said. The silence that followed was brief but had weight. Something moved across her face, not quite surprise, but a recalibration. "Can I ask why?" she said. Her voice was careful, not defensive. Something in it suggested she'd considered the possibility and was genuinely asking. "Because coming back as an employee changes everything," he said. "Even at double the salary, even with a bonus. I'd be coming back into a structure where the same fundamental problem exists. Decisions about the division get made by someone above me who may or may not understand what the division actually needs. That's what happened before. Note, not because you're a bad person or a bad executive in general, but because you were running a company worth $4 billion and one of its divisions was led by someone you trusted to handle it. Stopped looking closely enough to know when that trust was misplaced. She absorbed that. He watched her do it. She was someone who could receive a hard thing without immediately reacting to it, which was a quality he'd always respected about her, even when she drove him to the edge of his patience. "What would you take?" she said. He set down his coffee cup. "That's a different conversation," he said, "and it involves more than just you." Spent the 3 days before the meeting working on something he hadn't shown Irene yet, hadn't shown Carol, hadn't told Marcus or James or Sandra about. He'd worked on it in the evenings after Lily went to bed, with the apartment quiet and his laptop open, and the particular focused energy he got when he was building something from scratch. What he'd built was a proposal, not for a job, for a deal. The structure of it had come to him gradually. Over the weeks since Irene's call, he'd been thinking about it in the background of everything else he was doing on drives to Cincinnati, during client calls, once in the middle of helping Lily understand why fractions had to have common denominators before you could add them, which had required him to actually stop and think about it in a way he hadn't since 5th grade. The thinking had gone like this. Northbridge, as it currently existed, was a failing division of a larger company. Its value was eroding fast. The board wanted to save it, but didn't have the leadership to do so. Wanted to save it, but had lost the credibility with her own board to direct that salvation herself. The assets that made it worth saving, the remaining client relationships, the technical infrastructure, the institutional knowledge in the people still inside were real, only for another window of time. Ethan had something the board needed. The board had something Ethan didn't have, not alone, not yet. Capital, authority, the legal structure to make a formal transaction happen. There were others who had a stake in this outcome. He'd been making quiet calls for 2 weeks. Not commitments, just conversations. Careful ones, with people who had reason to care about what Northbridge became. He had a meeting on Thursday with Raymond Cho from Cincinnati, whose distribution company Ethan had stabilized over the past 2 months, and who had made a comment in their last session that Ethan had filed away without responding to at the time. If you ever put together something of your own, a real operation, not just consulting, I'd want to be part of that conversation. He had a call scheduled Friday with a private equity contact named Lynn Okafor, who ran a small firm that specialized in exactly this kind of turnaround acquisition, and who had reached out to Ethan 3 months ago after hearing his name from 2 different mutual contacts in the same week. He had a conversation, already completed over the phone, carefully worded with Ruth Nakamura at Castellan, who had terminated her contract with Northbridge in October, and who had told Ethan, unprompt, the relationship wasn't about the company name, it was about the people. And if the right people were running it, Castellan's door was not permanently closed. With Raymond Cho on Thursday, over lunch, at a place Raymond chose, a Thai restaurant in the Loop that Raymond visited so regularly the owner knew his order. Raymond was 64, stocky, wore shirts that were always slightly wrinkled in a way that suggested he bought good shirts and then didn't think about them. Again, yes, he had the particular confidence of someone who had built something real with his hands and didn't need to perform it. Tell me what you're thinking, Raymond said, after they'd ordered. Ethan told him. Raymond listened the way good business people listen, actively, not passively, asking 2 questions that were sharp enough to show he was tracking the details and not just the shape of the thing. When Ethan finished, Raymond sat for a moment with his tea. So you're not buying the whole company, Raymond said. Just the division and its assets. Client contracts, technical infrastructure, IP specific to the division's operations. The Sterling name doesn't come with it, this becomes a separate entity. Under your name? Under a structure that reflects who's actually building it, Ethan said. Which includes more than just me. Raymond nodded slowly. What are you looking for from me? Capital participation and a formal letter of support. The letter matters more than the money right now. I need to show the board that this isn't just me showing up with a plan and no backing. It needs to look like what it is, which is a real offer from real people with real resources. Picked up his fork and put it down without using it. Those 2 engineers, he said, the ones that got blamed for the project failure. Are they still there? The question surprised Ethan slightly. One of them. The other left in October. The one who's still there. Is he good, Ethan said. Yes, she's very good. Raymond nodded again. All right, he said. I'm in for the letter, and for a capital position we can negotiate. But I want to know these people are taken care of. Just employed, actually taken care of. That matters to me. It matters to me too, Ethan said. That's not a detail. That's the whole point. They shook hands over the remains of the pad thai, and Ethan drove back to his office, feeling something that was adjacent to momentum, not yet the real thing, but its approach. The Friday call with Lynn Okafor ran 90 minutes and ended with a commitment in principle, pending formal documentation. Lynn's firm had done 3 similar transactions and knew the structure well. She had questions that were hard and specific, and Ethan answered them without hedging, And the 2 times he didn't know an answer, he said so directly, which Lynn noted out loud as something she appreciated. Most people in your position would have tried to cover the gaps, she said. Most people in my position haven't already walked away from one situation where, pretending to have answers, you don't have caused the whole thing to collapse, he said. A brief pause. Fair enough, Lynn said. By the time Monday arrived, Ethan had what he needed. Raymond's letter, Lynn's conditional commitment, a written indication from Ruth Nakamura that Castellan would consider renewing a relationship with a restructured entity under Ethan's leadership, and a conversation with 2 other former clients, smaller ones, but real, who'd expressed similar interest. Called Irene Voss on Monday afternoon. I have a counterproposal, he said, for an employment arrangement, for an acquisition. Pause of the division. Yes, another pause longer. I think you should come in and present this to the full board. That's what I'm asking for, he said. The board meeting was on a Wednesday 2 weeks before Christmas. Ethan wore the same suit he'd worn when he walked out of the conference room on 9 months ago. That was deliberate. Not performance, not symbolisms. For its own sake, he just thought it mattered that he be recognizably himself in that room, not a different version who dressed up for the occasion. There were 7 board members present. Irene sat at one end. Vanessa sat at the other. She was there as majority shareholder, which she had every right to be, and she looked at Ethan when he walked in with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Hostile, not warm. Something in between that might have been recognition. He presented for 40 minutes. He went through the assessment findings, the financial structure of the proposed acquisition, the investor commitments, the client indications of interest, the operational plan for the first 90 days. He did it without a script, from notes he'd reduced to a single page, because he knew the material well enough that a script would have made it worse. When he was done, the questions came. Some were procedural. Some were harder. A board member named George Pittman, who was in his early 70s, and had the manner of someone who had seen a lot of people walk into rooms with proposals, asked Mr. Caldwell, why would you want this? You've built a successful consulting practice. You could keep doing that without any of this complexity. What is it that you actually want here? The room was quiet. Ethan thought about how to answer honestly without making it sound like a speech. There are people inside that division who gave years of their work to something they believed in, he said. Some of them are still there, running out the clock on something that's falling apart around them. Some of them left because they had to. What I want is for the thing they built to survive. Under my name, not as a monument to anything, just surviving and doing what it was always supposed to do. He paused. I also want to build something that's actually mine. Something where the decisions get made by people who understand what they're deciding. I couldn't do that inside the existing structure. This is the way I can. George Pittman looked at him for a moment, then wrote something on his notepad. The vote happened at the end of the meeting. Ethan waited outside the conference room in a hallway that smelled like the same carpet cleaner it had always smelled like, with a cup of coffee from the floor's break room that was adequate but not good. He stood near the window. The Chicago skyline in December, dark gray sky, the lights of the buildings coming on as the afternoon faded. Irene came out 22 minutes later. The board has approved the acquisition framework, she said, subject to final documentation and due diligence, which we'd want completed in 30 days. He nodded. There's a condition, she said. Vanessa requested it, and the board agreed to include it. He waited. She wants a meeting with you, private, before any documents are signed. He looked out the window for a moment. Okay, he said. They met the next afternoon in a small conference room on the 14th floor, not the big room on 18, not the room where any of this had started. A smaller room with a rectangular table and 4 chairs and a window that faced west. Vanessa was there when he arrived. She was standing at the window, not sitting, and she turned when he came in. She looked different than she had at Mercer's. Not weaker. He still didn't think she was capable of looking weak. It wasn't built into her the way it was built into other people, but something more open, less managed. He sat down. She sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. I've been trying to figure out how to do this right, she said finally. Right way to do it, he said. You just do it. She pressed her lips together briefly. What I said to you in March about fresh perspective, About the division's next phase of growth, I said it because I'd already made the decision, and I needed it to sound like a reasoned one. It wasn't. It was personal. Tyler needed something significant, and I thought this was something I could give him. She paused. I convinced myself you'd land somewhere, and it would be fine. I didn't think very hard about the people who didn't have the option of walking out. He was quiet, he let her say it. I didn't think about Marcus, who has 2 kids and a mortgage and who couldn't do what you did. I didn't think about Sandra, who's been in that building for 14 years and spent the last 9 months trying to keep things from burning down. She paused again. I didn't think about Deb, or James, or the 2 engineers who got named in that report. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. I made a decision based on what was convenient for me, and I told myself it was business. It cost people, Ethan said. Not harshly, just as a fact. Not abstractly, specifically. It cost Deb a role she'd built over 8 years. Cost 2 engineers their professional reputations in front of their colleagues. Cost Marcus 8 months of being scared about his job. He paused. It cost things that don't show up in the financial reports. She held his gaze. I know, she said again. And this time the weight behind it was different. It was the weight of someone who had actually been sitting with that knowledge, not just acknowledging it in the moment. He believed her. He didn't say so, but he believed her. The acquisition happens with conditions, he said. Negotiation conditions. I mean, conditions about how the business operates going forward. What conditions? The 2 engineers Tyler blamed in the post-mortem meeting get their situations formally corrected. Quietly, not in their personnel files, publicly, within the company. They were right. The documentation proves it. That gets acknowledged. Vanessa nodded. Marcus and Sandra, their roles are protected through the transition, and they get first right of refusal on any senior positions in the restructured entity. Agreed. And James Park gets made whole for the period he spent managing a project that was set up to fail by decisions made above him. He paused. The timeline change on Vertex was Tyler's decision. James's team didn't fail that project. The project failed because the person in charge ignored every warning they gave him. No, corrected in writing. Yes, she said quietly. He looked at her across the table. That's what I need before I sign anything. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands, then back at him. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Do you think I can fix what happened? Not the division. The other thing, the way I led, the judgment calls. She paused. Is that something that's fixable? He thought about the question, honestly. He thought about the Vanessa who'd walked into that conference room in March with absolute certainty that she was making the right call. He thought about the woman across this table who was asking a real question and not performing humility. I don't know, he said. I think you're smart enough to understand what went wrong. Whether that translates into actually doing it differently, I can't tell you that. Nobody can tell you that. That's a thing you find out by doing it. She nodded slowly. That's an honest answer. It's the only kind I have. She extended her hand across the table. He looked at it for a moment, not dramatic, not a pause for effect, just the natural moment of a person deciding something. He shook it. Her grip was firm and brief, and neither of them said anything afterward for a moment. Vanessa stood up, straightened her jacket in the habitual way she did, and walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. For what it's worth, she said, without turning around, with what you built here, the actual thing, the culture and the systems, and the reason clients stayed, I understood that it was good. I just didn't understand that it was you. A pause. I thought good things happened in good companies. I didn't think enough about the people who made a company good in the first place. She left. Ethan sat in the conference room for a few minutes after she'd gone. The west window showed the sky going dark over the city, the last of the December light draining out of it. A radiator clicked somewhere in the wall. He thought about what she'd said. Whether it was enough, that wasn't the right question. Things like this weren't about enough. They were about what was true and what you did with it. He took out his phone and called Marcus. It's done, he said when Marcus answered. The board approved the acquisition framework. We're going into due diligence. I need 30 days. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Ethan checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Marcus, yeah, Marcus said. His voice was thick. Yeah, I'm here. I need people I can trust on the inside during the due diligence period. You and Sandra, I need you steady for 30 more days. We can do 30 days, Marcus said. I know you can, Ethan paused. Tell Sandra. She's right here, Marcus said. She's been right here the whole time. He heard faintly, in the background of the call, Sandra's voice, asking something, seen Marcus telling her, and then a sound he couldn't quite identify. Something between a breath and a laugh, the sound of a person setting down a weight they'd been carrying for a long time. Okay, Ethan said, 30 days. He ended the call and sat in the empty conference room in the fading December light, in the same building he'd left 9 months ago with a badge on a table and no plan beyond the next hour. He had a plan now. It wasn't clean. It wasn't simple. There were 30 days of due diligence ahead, and documentation to execute and negotiations still to complete, and a transition plan that Carol was already building into a project timeline that made him tired just looking at it. There were clients to call, and conversations to have, and people who needed to be told things in a specific order for the whole thing to hold together. He was not under any illusion that this was going to be easy. None of the things worth doing had been easy. That had never been the point. He stood up, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, and looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, settling into its winter dark, the lights coming on across the towers, the lake invisible in the distance but present, the way it always was, a cold permanence at the edge of everything. Then he went to pick up his daughter from school, because it was Tuesday, and Tuesday was his night. And she'd said that morning she wanted soup for dinner, the kind with the little pasta stars, and he'd said he'd get the ingredients, and that was a promise he intended to keep. The due diligence took 33 days instead of 30, which was 3 days longer than Ethan had told Marcus and Sandra to hold on for, and which bothered him more than it should have, because he'd said 30 and he'd meant 30, and the difference felt like a small failure of his word, even though everyone involved understood that these things never landed exactly on schedule. Lynn Okafor's team found 2 additional financial irregularities during the review period, not large ones. Not the kind that changed the fundamental math of the deal, but the kind that required documentation and explanation and a round of calls with lawyers that ate an entire Thursday, and most of the Friday after it. Carol managed the calendar through that stretch with the particular grim efficiency she brought to situations she found irritating, but not insurmountable, which was most situations. The documents were signed on a Tuesday morning in January. Law firm's conference room on Michigan Avenue, with floor-to-ceiling windows that showed a gray lake and a grayer sky and snow that had been falling since Sunday, without any apparent intention of stopping. Ethan signed his name 9 times. Lynn signed for her firm. Raymond Cho had sent his son as his representative, a quiet man in his 30s named David, who had his father's eyes and a handshake that communicated he understood exactly what he was there for. Irene Voss was present as the board's representative. Vanessa was not in the room. That had been a mutual decision, arrived at through Irene, without drama. Yes, he'd intervened. There was nothing for Vanessa to sign. She'd already signed what she needed to sign, and her presence would have made the room complicated in ways that didn't serve the moment. Ethan hadn't asked for her absence. He hadn't needed to. Irene had understood. When it was done, Ethan sat for a moment in his chair while the lawyers gathered their papers, and Lynn checked something on her phone, and David Cho accepted a cup of coffee he probably didn't want. The room had the particular quality of silence that follows a significant thing not peaceful exactly, more like the pause between a door closing and the next thing beginning. Irene sat down beside him. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like I have a lot of work to do," he said. She smiled at that, a small one. "Yes, you do," she paused. "For what it's worth, and I recognize this is easy for me to say I think you're going to be all right," he said, not arrogant, just clear-eyed. She stood and extended her hand, and he shook it, and that was that. He drove back to his apartment through the snow with Carol on speakerphone, going through the first week's priority list, which was long enough that they were still on the call when he pulled into his parking garage. He sat in the car for the last 10 minutes of it, because going upstairs mid-call seemed wrong. "First day in the building is Monday," Carol said. "Monday," he confirmed. "I'll have the all-staff communication ready for you to review by Friday afternoon. You should send it before the weekend. People need to go into the weekend, knowing, not spend 2 days in the dark." "Agreed," he paused. "How are you feeling about all of this?" Carol was quiet for a moment. "I feel like I agreed to be operations director for a consulting firm and somehow ended up being operations director for a technology company turnaround, and I'm trying to decide if I should be angry about that." She said. I'm not. A pause. But I want a real title. Interim anything. Real. You'll have it, he said. I'll put it in writing this week. Good. She sounded satisfied. Go see your daughter. We have everything we need for Monday. He went upstairs. Lily was at Elena's. For the week they'd shifted the schedule slightly for the holidays, and the timing had worked out that way. Apartment was quiet. He made dinner for himself. Something simple. Eggs and toast, the kind of meal you make when you're too tired to make anything real and honest enough with yourself to admit it. Yes, he'd intervened. Kate, standing at the counter, felt like a thing he'd have to get back up from. After he stood at the window in the living room and watched the snow coming down over the city. It was the kind of snowfall that muffled everything. The street noise, the distance between buildings, the ordinary Tuesday night sounds of a city that didn't know or care what had just been signed in a conference room on Michigan Avenue. He thought about his father, briefly. His father had died when Ethan was 19, a heart attack. Sudden, warning, the kind of thing that doesn't give you time to prepare or say what should have been said. His father had worked for the same manufacturing company for 26 years, same building, same parking space, same lunch break. He'd been good at what he did. He'd never owned anything. He'd been let go at 54 when the company was acquired, and the new owners decided the division wasn't worth keeping. Ethan had been 12 when that happened. He remembered his father coming home that afternoon and sitting at the kitchen table without his jacket and not saying anything for a long time. He'd intervened. He'd been building against that image his whole career without quite knowing it. Building something that couldn't be taken away by someone else's acquisition, someone else's decision, someone else's nephew who needed a role. He had it now. It didn't feel the way he'd imagined it would feel when he was 12 years old watching his father sit at the kitchen table. Felt more complicated than that, and more real. No, and in some ways more fragile, because owning something meant the failures were also yours, the judgment calls were also yours. People depending on you were depending on you in a way that was actual and not metaphorical. He wasn't sure his father would have wanted this, the weight of it, but he thought his father would have understood why he did. Monday came cold and clear. The snow from the previous week packed into gray ridges along the sidewalks, the sky a hard blue that felt like an apology for the days of overcast. Ethan drove to the building alone. He'd thought about whether to make an arrival of it, whether to organize something, and decided against it. He wasn't coming back for the theater of it. He was coming back to work. He parked in the same garage he'd parked in for 9 years. Took the elevator to the 18th floor. Sandra was at her desk. She looked up when he came through the glass doors, and for a moment neither of them said anything. She looked the same, and not the same. The same careful hair, the same reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, the same organized desk that operated as a kind of command center for everything happening on the floor. But there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there a year ago, or that he hadn't noticed, and something in the set of her shoulders that suggested the 10 months of holding things together had cost something she was still in the process of getting back. She stood up. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, in the same tone she'd used the morning 9 months ago when she'd looked up from her desk and told him Vanessa was there with a look on her face he hadn't liked. Except this morning the look was different. This morning it was called relief if Sandra were the kind of person who showed relief, which she generally wasn't. So he noted it and didn't say anything about it. "Is your desk situation okay?" he asked. "It's the same desk," she said. "It was always the same desk." "Good," he said. "I'm going to need coffee and at 10 o'clock with you and Marcus both. 30 minutes. Already on the calendar," she said. He looked at her. "You put it on the calendar before I asked?" "I put it on the calendar Friday," she said, with the particular satisfaction of someone whose Ferntets 30 years being right about what people are going to need before they know they need it. "I also blocked your 11:30 because you're going to need time after the 10 o'clock to think." He almost smiled. "Thank you, Sandra. Don't thank me," she said. "Just don't ever put someone named Tyler in charge of anything again," he said, and went to his office. Tyler's name was not on the door anymore. That had been handled in December, during the transition period. The office he'd intervened. The office had been cleaned out and returned to something close to its previous configuration, though not exactly. The desk was in a slightly different position, and someone had moved the whiteboard to the wrong wall. He'd move it back later. He set his bag down and stood at the north-facing window. The lake was visible today. It was the kind of January morning where the air was clean enough that the distance collapsed, and you could see the water all the way to where it met the horizon dark blue, nearly still, the ice along the shore catching the early light. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to, ceremonially, just because it was a good window, and he'd missed it. Then he sat down and opened his laptop and started working. The all-staff meeting was at 2 o'clock in the main conference room on 18, the big room. The same table, the same chairs. No! 61 people. That was how many were left of the 112 who'd been on the division's payroll the day Ethan had walked out. The rest had left or been laid off in the intervening months, and the absences were visible in the room the way empty chairs are always visible, each one its own small story. He stood at the head of the table, not where Vanessa had stood. He didn't take the same position. He stood to the side and looked at the room for a moment before he spoke. Were faces he recognized from 9 years of mornings. Marcus, sitting near the middle of the table, with his arms crossed in the way. He crossed them when he was paying attention to something serious. Sandra near the door, same as always. James parked toward the back, watching Ethan, with an expression that had something careful in it, something that hadn't fully let go yet of the months of being ignored and overridden. There were also faces he didn't recognize. People hired in the past year, people who'd come in under Tyler's regime and had no context for who Ethan was or what the division had been before. He'd need to earn something with those people that he didn't have to earn with the others. It was fair. That was how it should work. He didn't have a prepared speech. He had a few things he'd decided he needed to say, and he said them. The last 10 months have been hard, he said. I'm not going to stand here and tell you they weren't, or that everything is fine now, because it isn't yet. We have serious work ahead of us. We've lost clients, we've lost people, we've lost ground that took years to build and is going to take time to rebuild. He paused. I'm not going to pretend that isn't true. The room was very quiet. What I will tell you is this. The decisions that get made about this division going forward will be made by people who understand what this division actually does and why it matters. You will not be ignored when you raise a risk. You will not be blamed for failures that came from decisions made above you. And you will not be asked to be something different from what you are in order to keep your job. He paused again. That's not a speech. That's a description of how this place is going to operate. I'll be held to it the same as anyone else. Someone near the back, he didn't know her name yet. One of the newer people said quietly, "It's not quite to him happened. Quite to anyone. How do we know you mean that?" A few heads turned. She seemed to realize she'd said it out loud and straightened slightly. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. "Priya," she said. A beat of silence. "Priya Mehta. I've been here 7 months." "Priya, you don't know that I mean it yet, and you shouldn't take my word for it." He looked at her directly. "You should watch what happens when someone brings a problem to leadership in this building and see how it's handled. You should watch what happens when a project hits trouble and see whether the people who raised the early warnings get credit or get blamed. You should watch and form your own opinion. And if the opinion you form is that nothing has actually changed, I want to hear about it." She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded once, a small decisive thing. He looked back at the room. "We have work to do," he said. "Go do it." The first 90 days were not clean. He'd built a 90-day plan with Carol that he thought was realistic, and it turned out to be realistic in the way that most plans are realistic, correct about the general direction, and wrong about a significant number of the specific details. The 2 engineers Tyler had blamed in the postmortem were Priya Mehta, as it happened, and a man named Carter Davis, who had left in October and was now working at a firm in Seattle. The written correction, the formal acknowledgement that the Vertex failure had resulted from ignored risk documentation and not from their performance, went into the company record in the first week, as promised. Ethan sent Carter Davis a personal email explaining what had been done. Carter didn't respond for 2 weeks and then sent a brief reply. "Thank you. It shouldn't have needed to happen. I'm glad it did." Ethan read it twice and filed it. Priya Mehta turned out to be one of the sharper technical minds in the building. Ethan figured this out in the 3rd week, when she brought him a problem with the Castellan re-engagement proposal, not a complaint, a request for direction. but a specific observation about a section of the proposal that made an assumption about Castellan's infrastructure that was no longer accurate given changes they'd made in the previous 6 months. He looked at her across his desk. How do you know what changes they made? Called Ruth Nakamura's technical lead last week, she said. I wanted to make sure we weren't going into the conversation with bad information. You called Castellan's technical lead on your own initiative. Was that wrong? She asked it neutrally, not defensively. He said that was exactly right. He paused. Who did you call on your own initiative the last time you identified something like this? She understood what he was asking. Nobody, she said. Put it in a report. And the report went to Tyler. The report went into a folder, she said, which was functionally the same thing. He updated the proposal. He also mentioned to Carol that evening that Priya Mehta should be on the list of people to watch for the project lead roles they'd need to fill as the rebuilding accelerated. Carol already had her on the list. The Castellan conversation happened in the 4th week. Ethan flew to their offices in Boston. He didn't do it by video call. He made the trip because Ruth Nakamura was the kind of person who noticed that kind of decision and drew correct conclusions from it. They spent 2 hours in her conference room going through what had happened and what it would take to rebuild the relationship. Ruth was direct and not punishing about it. She asked hard questions and accepted hard answers and didn't require Ethan to perform contrition he didn't feel. I need to know this won't happen again, she said. A guarantee? I know you can't guarantee anything. I need to understand what's structurally different now. Explained the ownership structure, the authority structure, who made decisions and why. He explained what had gone wrong with Tyler's tenure in operational terms, not personal ones, and he told her what safeguards now existed to catch that kind of problem before it became what it had become. Ruth listened and asked 2 more questions and then said, we'd want a 6-month pilot, reduced scope from what we had before. If it goes well, we talk about a full renewal. That's fair, he said. It is fair, she said. It's more than fair, honestly. I liked what you built here before, Ethan. I want to like it again. He flew back to Chicago that evening on the last flight of the day. Sitting in a window seat. With a bourbon he nursed for most of the flight without finishing, watching the lights of the country below. He was tired, in the way he'd been tired in the good years at Northbridge, the kind of tired that came from doing something that mattered and not being done yet. Yes, he'd intervened. Marcus came into Ethan's office in the 6th week, which was a Friday afternoon when most people had already started edging toward the door. Closed the door behind him, which he only did when something was specifically private, and sat down in the chair across the desk. I need to tell you something, Marcus said. Tell me. I got a call last week. A competitor, good offer. He said it evenly, watching Ethan. What did you tell them? I told them I'd think about it. He paused. I'm telling you because you deserve to know. Not because I've decided either way. Ethan looked at him. Marcus Webb had been his steadiest constant through 9 years and 10 months of everything, including the months when Ethan wasn't there, and Marcus had stayed and been scared and kept the lights on anyway. Would make you stay, Ethan asked. Honestly? Marcus said. What you're already building. If this is actually what you're saying it is, if this holds, I want to be part of it. He paused. But I need to know it's real. I need to see another 60 days. See them, Ethan said. And if at the end of 60 days the offer's still on the table and you want to take it, I'll understand. Marcus looked at him for a moment. You're not going to try to talk me out of it? I'm not going to lie to you to keep you here. You'd figure it out, and then I'd deserve to lose you. He paused. Stay because it's worth staying for. That's the only reason that works. Marcus nodded slowly. He stood up. He started for the door and then stopped. The people who built this place, he said, without turning around. We needed someone to know we did, not as a plaque, just someone actually knowing it. I know it, Ethan said. Marcus left. He stayed, as it turned out, not just for 60 days. The ownership shares were formalized in the 4th month. Ethan had structured it from the beginning. A meaningful at the equity stake, distributed it among the people who had been with the division through the worst of it, and who were the architecture of whatever came next. He'd worked out the structure with Lynn's firm over several weeks, not symbolic, performative. Actual ownership with actual value tied the division's performance. Called a meeting to announce it. All staff, just the people it directly affected, 12 people in total, including Marcus, Sandra, James Park, and Priya Mehta. Explain the structure, the percentages, what it meant in practical terms. The room was quiet in the way rooms get when people are processing something they didn't expect. Sandra, who had not visibly reacted to almost anything in the 9 months of holding the building together by force of will, put her hand over her mouth for a moment. Then she took it away and looked at the table, and then looked at him. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "Yes, I did," he said. It wasn't grand or complicated, it was just true. These people had built the thing he was now buying. That had a value. The value had a form. He was giving it the form. James Park was quiet through most of the meeting. Afterward, when people were filing out, he stayed behind. Ethan was gathering his notes. James stood near the window, the north-facing one, the one with the lake, and looked out for a moment. "I stayed here 10 months, James said. "I stayed when I should probably have left. I kept thinking about what you said, that things built the way Tyler was building them don't hold. I kept waiting for it. It happened," Ethan said. "It happened." James was quiet. "I spent some of those months pretty angry. At Vanessa. At myself for not leaving when I had the chance." He paused. "I was angry at you too for a while, for leaving us there." Ethan didn't say anything. "I'm not anymore," James said. "I understand why you did it. You couldn't have done anything for us by staying. You'd have just been another person getting worn down." He turned from the window. "But I needed to say that there was a period," Ethan said. "I thought about it. Did you feel like you abandoned us?" Question was direct and deserved a direct answer. Ethan said. "Some nights, not all nights, but some." He paused. "I made the only decision I could make at the time, with the information and the options I had. I'd make it again, but that doesn't mean it was costless." James nodded. That seemed to be what he needed. He picked up his jacket and headed for the door, and then paused with his hand on the frame, the same spot where Vanessa had paused 9 months ago, with a different question. "The division is going to be okay," James said. "Not a question." "Think so," Ethan said. "We're not there yet, but I think so." "Good," James said, and left. 1 year after, Ethan placed his badge on a conference table and walked away from everything he'd built under someone else's name. The Northbridge division, now operating as Northbridge Consulting Group, its own entity, independent, posted its first profitable quarter as a standalone operation. Dramatically profitable. Not the kind of number that generated headlines. The margin was what Carol called respectable, which in Carol's vocabulary meant she wasn't embarrassed to show it to the investors, and also that there was significant room to grow, which she preferred to false ceilings. 3 of the clients who'd left under Tyler had returned Castellan in month 6. After the pilot went, though, Ethan had told Ruth Nakamura it would go. 2 smaller accounts who'd reached out quietly after hearing through professional networks that Northbridge had changed hands and changed leadership. A 4th former client, one that Ethan hadn't expected to recover, sent a preliminary inquiry in month 11 that Carol flagged on a Monday morning with a sticky note that said simply, "This one surprised me." He wrote back personally. He didn't know yet whether it would become something, but he wrote back. The legal matter from the Vertex failure was settled in month 8. The healthcare client, who'd suffered 11 days of operational disruption, had pursued damages through their legal team. The settlement, which came from Sterling Technologies' liability insurance, rather than from the new entity, was disclosed in the financial documentation that the board made public. The amount was not trivial. Tyler's formal liability in the settlement was a matter of record. He had, as far as anyone knew, moved to a different city. His name was not discussed. Priya Mehta was promoted to project delivery lead in month 7, which was the role Deb Ramos had held before Tyler dismantled it. Ethan called Deb to tell her personally, not as an obligation, but because he thought she should know. Deb had landed a director role, at a firm that was treating her correctly. And she received the news about Priya the way people receive good news about something they've moved past, warmly and without wanting it back. "Is she good?" Deb asked. "She's better than I was at that stage," Ethan said. "Then it's fine," Deb said. "Make sure she knows she can push back on you." "I'm encouraging it," he said. "Good," Deb said. "You needed someone to push back on you back then, too. You were just too surrounded by people who needed their jobs to do it." A pause. "I should have done it more." "You did it enough," he said. "You were right more often than I listened." She laughed at that. "A genuine one. Is deeply accurate. Take care of yourself, Ethan." You too," he said. He took Lily to the Science Museum on a Saturday in February. The same museum she'd visited with her class almost a year ago, the one with the planetarium show and the volcano demonstration. She'd been asking to go back since December, with the particular persistence of a child who has decided something matters and sees no reason why it shouldn't happen. They spent 4 hours there. She knew things he didn't know, facts she'd accumulated from books and her tablet, and her mother's patience and the class trip itself, and she deployed them with the casual authority of a person sharing information they consider important. He asked genuine questions because he was genuinely interested, and she answered them with a seriousness that periodically broke into laughter when he said something she found ridiculous. They ate lunch in the museum cafeteria. Mediocre sandwiches and apple juice and cookies were slightly stale and entirely worth it. He watched her eat and thought about the morning. She'd climbed into the car after school, and he'd told her he'd left his job. And she'd asked him, straight and practical, if they were going to be okay. She hadn't asked again, whether that was because she'd believed him the first time, or because she was 8 years old now and had moved on to other concerns, Jupiter's moons, fractions, the ongoing question of whether the family down the hall had a cat or a dog, he couldn't be certain. But they were okay. In some resolved, uncomplicated way, his life was still complicated. The work was still hard. The nights still ran long, and the mornings still started earlier than he'd like. He still made decisions that kept him up at night, still got things wrong and had to correct them, and felt the particular low-grade discomfort of being responsible for something that other people depended on. He's still worried about Lily, about Elena, Nook, Marcus, whether Priya was getting enough support or too much, but whether Cincinnati was going to renew their contract in the spring, or whether Raymond chose David was right, that they needed to restructure the engagement. He was not okay in the sense of having arrived somewhere clean and finished. He was okay in the sense that the things he was responsible for were his, and the people depending on him were depending on him, because they'd chosen to, because they had no other option. The life he was living felt like his actual life, and not something borrowed or provisional. He thought about what Vanessa had said in that small conference room in December, that she'd understood the division was good, but hadn't understood that he was why it was good. Kralt's Tetoman, that she'd thought good things happened in good companies, without thinking about the people who made a company good. It wasn't a complicated mistake. That was the thing about it. It was the most ordinary kind of mistake, one where you look at the result and don't trace it back to the cause, where you see the revenue and the retention rates and the client relationships, and you think, this is what our company does. This is what this specific person has built. And if you remove them, these things do not continue on their own. People made this mistake with other people all the time. With parents, with teachers, with the quiet, competent persons in any organization who holds things together and never has their name on the door. You stop seeing the hand that's doing the work because the work looks like it's just happening. He didn't think Vanessa Sterling was a villain. He didn't think she was a fundamentally bad person or a bad executive in every context. She was a person who had made a significant mistake with real consequences and who had eventually looked at those consequences without looking away. Was worth something. It wasn't worth everything, but it was worth something. On the drive home from the museum, Lily fell asleep in the back seat, which she'd started insisting she was too old to do and continued doing anyway on long days. He'd intervened. He drove in the quiet with the radio off, and the late February light going sideways through the windows, and he thought about his father at the kitchen table in his jacket, about the version of himself at 12, watching a man find out that 26 years of showing up meant nothing to the people who'd benefited from the showing up. He thought about what it would mean for Lily to grow up, knowing that her father had built something that was his. Not just professionally, though that mattered. He wasn't going to pretend it didn't, but the thing underneath it. When something happened that wasn't right, he'd stood up and said so, and then gone and built a different thing. That dignity wasn't a luxury you could only afford when the stakes were low. This is what she'd take from it. She was 8. The things that shape children are rarely the things you intend, and the things you intend are rarely the ones that stick. Facts of it would be there, available to her, when she was old enough to look. Thought that was enough, maybe more than enough. Pulled into the parking garage and cut the engine and sat for a moment in the quiet. He wasn't the same person who'd driven out of this same garage 11 months ago, with no music and no plan and the full weight of a decision that hadn't fully landed yet. He was the same in the ways that mattered and different in the ways that had needed to be. He'd learned some things he should have known already. He'd confirmed some things he'd suspected, but couldn't prove until he was outside the structure that had prevented him from proving them. The main thing he'd confirmed was simple enough to say, though it had taken 11 months and a significant amount of difficulty to actually understand it in his bones rather than just his head. The value of the work had always been his. The building it was housed in had never owned it. The badge he'd put on the table in March had never been the thing that mattered. What mattered was what he knew how to do, and that he'd taken with him when he left. And it had been there the whole time, in the engagement and the Cincinnati contract, and the 12 pages he'd handed Irene Voss, and the handshake across a conference table in December. He'd carried it out the door himself, without knowing he was doing it. He got out of the car and went around to the back seat and gently unclipped Lily's seatbelt without waking her. She stirred slightly and then resettled. He picked her up. She was getting almost too big for, and carried her to the elevator and up to their floor, and into the apartment and into her bed, and she didn't wake through any of it, which struck him as an expression of a trust so complete it didn't require consciousness. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment in the dark. Then he went to his desk, because he had a Monday morning ahead of him and a client report that needed one more pass and an email to Ruth Nakamura about the Q2 proposal timeline. He opened his laptop. The screen lit the room. He got to work.